Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be taking a brief look at the Indus Valley in our continuing study of world civilizations. If we look at what's called the subcontinent of India, notice going from left to right, we see the Iranian plateau, that area that we know in the ancient world as Persia. And then we come to the Indus River. This is a river system that's actually flowing down from the Himalayas to the north. And there's actually two river systems that flow down from the same area. We've got the Indus River that flows on the west side of the Indian subcontinent, and then the Ganges River that flows on the east side of that subcontinent into the Bay of Bengali. Right now, we're focused more upon the Indus River. Notice that it is hemmed on of course, to the south. You have the Arabian Sea, the Indian part of the Indian Ocean. You have the Thar Desert to the east. You have the Iranian Plateau to the west. And so, in a sense, this area is somewhat geographically isolated. You say, well, what about that other river system, the Ganges? They were separated by some heavy forests back in early history. Although we're going to see an invention that causes those forests to be less of an obstacle. We're looking at another map of exactly the same area. The Indus Valley civilization is going to grow up along that Indus River. Notice that you have the Khyber Pass. You've got passes through the Hindu Kush, those passes are going to be utilized to bring new peoples down into that area. Our earliest civilization, and I'm not saying the first people, but the earliest civilization, remember, civilization was where you begin to have culture and buildings and cities. The Harappan civilization, beginning around 3300, and I'm using some very round dates, 3300 to 1700 BC. It was completely unknown until the 1920s, only about 100 years ago. This entire culture and civilization was unknown to scholars, to historians. No records had survived, and it relies entirely upon archaeological discoveries that were made at that time. They found cities with multi-story buildings in place. There were grid patterns to the streets where the streets were set at right angles. We do that in a modern city. Ancient cities didn't often have that sort of thing. You had sewer systems that were built with piping underneath the buildings and underneath the streets. This was contemporary with what we've seen already in early Mesopotamia and Egypt. So, as we have civilization growing and developing in Egypt with the pyramids and early Mesopotamia with the ziggurats, we have also a high degree of civilization being attained here in India along the Indus River. And yet, there are some very interesting differences. You go to Egypt, you can see the hieroglyphs from that very early period. They had writing. You go to Mesopotamia, you see the writing, the clay tablets developing and then becoming eventually the cuneiform. Here with the Harappan civilization, there was little to no writing that took place. The language, what language they did have is unknown to us. They did have pictures, perhaps pictograms, where we haven't been able to decipher them. We're not even sure if it's something you can decipher. Are they just isolated pictures? Are they actually put together in some sort of message? We simply do not know. But we do know that there was already trade going on, and the reason we know this is because you would find little ornaments that were made in India, and they would show up in Mesopotamia, and vice versa. There was trade going back and forth already at this very early date. Here's an example. This is the Pashupati seal, excuse my pronunciation. Notice it is early 3rd millennia BC, and there's a seated figure surrounded by animals. It's thought because of this that he depicts the lord of the animals, and notice how he has the great tusks on his head, sort of ornamental, maybe a water buffalo that has been killed and used for his for his headpiece, and he's surrounded on one side by the tiger, and on the other side by the water buffalo, and you can see other large animals around him, and he is master of the domain. Now, around 1750 BC, we see a new group coming into the area, uh, Indo-Aryan migration. It used to thought that this was an invasion, and we don't know for sure that it wasn't, but it seems to have happened over a more extended period of time. So you have newcomers coming into the area, and with them come some new ideas that will eventually develop into the caste system that you still have to some degree in India even today. This caste system is based sort of when you look at a human body. There are first there's the head. And these are the Brahmins, the priests, the scholars, the teachers, the one that use their mind for a living. Next, there are the arms, the Kshatriyas, the rulers, the warriors, the administrators, the ones that sort of make things go. Next, there are the Vaishyas, the farmers, the merchants, depicted by the legs. And then finally, you go all the way down to the feet. The Shudras, these are the laborers, the ones that you say, well, everybody steps on them. That's not as low as you can go. Below that are the untouchables, the ones without caste. And the worst thing of all was considered to be an untouchable. Now, this caste system begins already to be set up and rooted. And of course, it seems to be those outsiders that bring the idea of the caste in. And of course, they have themselves at the top of the system, and they have everybody else below them. And so this introduces now the Vedic period from 1500, again, round numbers, 1500 to around 500 BC, so about 1,000 years. And the Aryans who have now come into the area of of northwestern India continue to move to the east, a gradual eastward, not migration, but expansion. They are speaking an Indo-European language. Now, when you say Aryan, remember that sounds a lot like the people of Iran, Aryan, Iran. It's the same people group, or at least I should say a related people group. Iranians are Indo-Europeans, and they're the first to tell you if you ever go there or meet any Iranian, what they used to call Persians. They have also introduced a new animal to the area, the introduction of the horse. And this is part of what was possibly their pre-nomadic background from the past before coming into this area. We get to 1200 BC, and we have the Iron Age just as it existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia, so it also comes to India, that new invention. And with the Iron Age, you have now the iron-headed axe, and that helps them to begin clearing out some of those forests in the area of northern India, which will facilitate the expansion to the west, to the east, to the Ganges River. And so they've already come to the Indus, but now we see them moving also and expanding into the area of the Ganges River plain. And so kingdoms begin to develop now on the Ganges plain, and there's not really a strong delineation, Indus versus Ganges, two different river systems, but now beginning to be a bit more connected. It's during this period, and it gives rise to the name, that the Vedas are composed. The word Veda just means knowledge, and these are orally transmitted because we still don't have a written language with a written alphabet. We're still using pictograms if we're using them at all. And the Vedas are orally transmitted. This is a memory culture. So you say, well, how much can I remember? Quite a lot, it turns out. And where these entire odes and books with many multiple chapters are passed on by word of mouth and memorized by the adherents that pass them on from teacher to student and on down the line. Now we get to the end of this period, and this is going to be a very short survey. We have Darius the Great. You remember him from the Persians. We actually see him as the one who had given the Jewish people to complete the reconstruction of their temple. But he invades from Persia and comes now into India. And it's around the same time, maybe right at that time, maybe a little bit later, because the dates aren't certain, where we have the Buddha. That's not his name, that's a title that's given to him after the fact, but a spiritual leader who will eventually become quite popular, not only here, but we've looked in China to see how Buddhism is actually going to be transported to China at a later date. And so, what I want to do in closing is just compare Hinduism with Buddhism, both coming from India. Hinduism had begun around 1500 BC, maybe earlier. It's hard to say because, again, no written language. So, how are you going to know? With Buddhism, founded by Buddha around 500, there's some that want to put that his date a little bit later, or sorry, a little bit earlier. No, you're later. I was correct. But usually you say around 500 BC. They both hold to reincarnation. That is that you're in this life, and then when you die, you come back as someone else or something else. It might not be a human being; it might be a butterfly or some sort of a cockroach. So you better watch out how you live this life because that's going to impact the next one. Hinduism had seen that caste system that was embraced. I'm not saying Hinduism invented it, but it latched onto it and it became a fundamental part of Hinduism where whatever caste you're in, you are there to stay. Buddha taught by contrast. He recognized there was a caste system, but he says that doesn't have to stop you. You can transcend that. And so he does not push this whole idea of a caste system. Hinduism had sacred texts, but initially they were not written. And so throughout the periods we've been looking at for the early history of India, they were orally transmitted. The Vedas. Buddhism, you're eventually going to have the writings of Buddha because by the time they're written down, you're actually going to have Sanskrit and languages being put to writing. And so they are able to be passed on and then transported even to other countries, like we said, China. With Hinduism, the goal is enlightenment. With Buddhism, the goal is to find an end to suffering. With Hinduism, it is polytheistic, believing in many different gods, three primary ones, but then a number of different gods. Buddhism is actually non-theistic, not necessarily denying the existence of God, but it doesn't just, that's not the conversation that he is having. Now, when we compare these two systems with Christianity, we see quite a difference. Christianity does not hold to reincarnation. Instead, it holds to a one-day resurrection where Jesus rose from the dead and we're going to rise one day too. In Christianity, we see that Jesus is not, he just doesn't bring enlightenment. He is the light. With regard to suffering, he is the one who suffered for us. And yet, if we follow him, we might find suffering in this world. And yet, there is coming a day when that will be put aside. And of course, Christianity is monotheistic, unabashedly. We believe in one God and one mediator, the man, Christ Jesus.